I'm Kevin Teo, COO at AVPN, and I'm glad you're able to join us for today's webinar. We have many AVPN members on this call, and for those of you new to the organization, we are a network of funders and resource providers with over 600 members across 32 markets. Our mission is to move capital towards impact in Asia by providing social investors like yourselves opportunities to connect with key stakeholders across various sectors and markets, to learn from one another and to find opportunities for action. Today's webinar on building and investing in Asia's natural capital sector is organized in partnership with the RS Group and is very well aligned with AVPN's Climate Action Platform, which was launched in 2019. With more than 270 members focused on climate-related topics, the vision of this platform is to unlock capital in a more targeted and effective manner into climate solutions and to engage with climate leaders and potential investors to find new and impactful ways to move capital. Please note that this session will be recorded, and we will make this recording available on the AVPN website subsequently. We encourage you to introduce yourself to other participants, chat with the speakers, and you can do this through the chat tab located in the window below. Please also send us questions through the Q&A pod. A quick introduction on the speakers today. As Managing Director, Ronnie leads and manages the strategy, operations, and development of RS Group's activities in Hong Kong and globally. RS Group is a mid-sized Hong Kong-based family office committed to creating a paradigm shift in people's values and priorities so that economic growth will support, instead of jeopardize, human development and environmental sustainability. She led the launch of RS Group's Impact Report in 2016 and the incubation of the Sustainable Finance Investment in 2018, a private investor community platform that aims to drive demand and promote sustainable finance in Hong Kong. Chris is director and co-founder of Terranomics and has played an instrumental role in the allocation of several $100 million in public and private investments to sustainable land use and conservation programs. Chris was previously the founder of PwC's Forestry and Sustainable Land Use team and has been a leading voice on sustainable land use and ecosystem economics. Currently, Chris drives the Natural Capital Initiative, aimed at deploying catalytic capital to support innovative investment solutions that can protect and enhance natural capital in Asia. And finally, James is founder and director of Sustained Value, a leading UK network-based sustainability management consulting firm he established in 2011. He has 30 years of experience in impact valuation, which is quantifying and valuing natural, social, and human capital impacts and dependencies for businesses, financial institutions, family offices, and governments around the world. During this time, he has undertaken several hundred environmental and social valuation studies and developed many bespoke ESG tools to help identify and evaluate investments. And at this stage, it is my honor to turn it over to Ronnie to share with us RS Group's Natural Capital Initiative. Ronnie, over to you, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, for tuning in today. Before I start, I want to say a big thank you to Kevin and AVPN team for allowing us to share this important piece of work, which is the feasibility around nature-based solutions in Asia. And I also want to thank Chris and James, who've been absolutely wonderful partners with us along this journey. It took quite a few months, but we got there in the end. It was a very productive and fruitful journey for us. We learned a lot, and we're very pleased that we can share this report and the key findings and some of the next steps with you all today. As I mentioned, this is a feasibility report that we did together with Terranomics and Sustained Value. We think this is actually really important because this is the first top-down landscape review or research that's been done here in Asia, focusing in on Southeast Asia. And through this study, we actually looked at over 50 different types of business models across 5 different verticals, including avoided land and ocean use, sustainable land management, sustainable ocean management, sustainable supply chain, as well as regenerative agriculture. Chris and James will go into a lot more details later on the methodology, the scoring system, the approach, and some of the key findings. But before we go into that, we wanted to share a bit on sort of the context and the reason why we decided to do this feasibility. So as you can see here on the slide, this is actually part of our natural capital initiative for RS Group, which is really around mobilizing private capital into nature-based businesses solutions here in Southeast Asia through deploying catalytic capital from ourselves, with the aim at ultimately is to build up the ecosystem, especially in the area of pipeline and talent. And so people ask us, oh, why choose nature-based solutions? And I think overall it's part of the climate change focus that we have now. And we see nature as actually the most proven and efficient way or tool to fight against climate change. And some of you've heard is that nature itself provides up to 37% of the kind of mitigation needs or efforts that's needed to stabilize the climate and the 1.5 degree target by 2030. So that's really a big chunk versus all the different technologies out there. And it's free, and it's really our default mechanism. But not only that, in terms of the climate mitigation, but it also provides a lot of the co-benefits in the form of food, water, and of course the biodiversity, the wildlife that comes along with it overall, so that we do and can have a sustainable and healthy planet to live on. But I think also more recently, there's increasing evidence to show that there is a direct link between protecting nature as well as economic benefits that come from that. A recent McKinsey study actually gave a lot of evidence to show that for every $1 that we invest into nature, you can generate more than $3.6 in environmental related income. So there is that direct link that helps to support nature protection. And last of all is the funding gaps. Nature, I think right now only accounts for less than 2% of all the climate finance funding that goes to this area. And so obviously that's a very small amount, especially if you compare to the 37% of mitigation efforts that it has. So every year has been estimated over $700 billion gap in funding that is needed. So it's a hugely underfunded yet important area. And so that's partly why we decided that we must focus on this area, especially here in Asia. And as part of this effort on natural capital, one of the first things that we did was we launched a blended finance design funding window with Convergence, which is a blended finance platform, back towards the end of 2019. So it's a $3 million facility that gives out feasibility and proof of concept grants to nature-based solutions here in Asia. And so far, we've given or we've approved almost around 6 different grants to 6 different organizations, and we've run the facility for about 1.5 years. And through this, we've seen a very healthy amount of applications coming in, which basically proves that there is a need for this type of early stage funding to develop these projects. But also what we learned through this facility very quickly is that there is a missing middle, which is after we give out these grants, there could be feasibility proof of concept. There's still a long way for these ventures to go before they reach the point where they are ready for all the institutional capital that's coming in. And there is a lot of that. Some people call last year as the Year of Biodiversity, which is where we see all these big banks, big funds coming in with $100 million fund, $1 billion fund. They are all looking for the one thing, which is pipeline. And so that gave us the idea we must provide more intervention to build up the pipeline in this area for this region. And so that gave us the idea of the Nature Venture Builder, which I'll talk a little bit more towards the end. But that before we could launch the venture building, we wanted to then run this feasibility study that can help us to analyze what that state of play is of the different business models right now in Asia, as well as what the opportunities and challenges are for them to scale, and ultimately to narrow down the key areas that the venture builder should focus on. So with that, I will pass it on to Chris, who will go into the feasibility, as well as James a lot more. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thank you very much for the introduction. Also, Kevin, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'll just do a quick check on the audio just before I dive into the slides.
Yep, loud and clear, Chris.
Fantastic. Okay, so hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining, and we appreciate you taking an interest in this particular area. Terranomics is a UK-based consultancy, and we specialize in attracting private investment into primarily sustainable land use projects, but also increasingly marine projects as well. And please do have a look at terranomics.org if you'd like more information on the kind of work and projects and clients we work with. Okay, so if we could just move on to the first slide. So what I'm going to do is try to give you a fairly rapid overview of the approach we took. This was an intellectually challenging project for us, because we were trying to compare, for RS's benefit, trying to compare vastly different business models spanning terrestrial and marine activities, and to do that in a comparable and consistent way, which allowed RS as potential investors to then make some overall assessments on prioritization. So I'll explain a bit about how we did that, and then get to what most of you, I assume, will be most interested in, which is the findings, the kinds of models that we prioritized. So in terms of the context, I think Ronnie has just done a great job of explaining the context to this, but what I wanted to just emphasize really was RS's interests in nature-based solutions and nature-focused businesses in Southeast Asia. And when we come on to how we scored and prioritized some of these different business model and investment opportunities, you'll understand the emphasis we placed on positive impacts on nature. The 5 socio-economic transitions I'll explain over LEAF, but essentially, as Ron has already explained, the aim with this exercise was to pave the way through some consistent and structured analysis for a nature venture builder's development. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. So the 5 socio-economic transitions, as we phrased them, were ecosystem restoration and avoided land and ocean use expansion, productive and regenerative agriculture, sustainable management of ocean resources, sustainable management of forests, and transparent and sustainable supply chains. And there was a slight bit of overlap between some of these, as you might imagine. Productive and regenerative agriculture also overlaps with agroforestry, which overlaps with sustainable forest management. So there was some overlap here, but those were the 5 economic transitions that this study really explored. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the overall approach that we took here, the aim was to shortlist business models. We began with a very long list of models that we felt had the potential for positive impact on nature, and essentially were also investable in the short to medium term. So we shortlisted those business models we thought were most promising, and then we looked at the operational challenges for each of those and the enabling conditions to scale those, and the role that a nature venture builder could play in creating a better, brighter future for those individual business models. We also concluded with some recommendations in terms of geographic focus areas and sort of partnership possibilities for RS. So that was the overall approach, was really shortlisting business models, exploring how those could be developed in the region, and then looking at very specific recommendations for RS in terms of who it would work with and how. So Kevin, over LEAF, in terms of the information sources, so we had a team of, I think, 6 of us, a core team of 6 of us, both from Terranomics and from James's company, Sustained Value. We were guided really well by RS Group and Poseidon in terms of really drawing out sort of big picture messages and challenges and understanding ways around those. We used a combination of desktop research, so that was very much using published analysis and data sets. And then we supplemented that with targeted interviews. And we interviewed people who were involved in specific deals in certain subsectors. We interviewed companies that were implementing certain projects on the ground. We interviewed thematic and sector-specific specialists in NGOs, for example, really to get their understanding and insights in terms of growth possibilities for certain sectors, as well as potential for positive impact on nature. And in some circumstances, Terranomics and others in the group had experience from actually working on structuring some of these deals. So we had some sort of inside knowledge of certain deals. The research method began with some overview research, just looking at those 5 transitions across all of Asia. So that was very high level research. And we looked at spatial and market forecasts. So for example, if we take certified forestry as an example, what we were looking there spatially was things like the extent of forest cover and forest cover under threat, the hectares that were under concession licenses or had achieved some level of certification to forest management standards. But we were also looking at market forecasts as well, so the growth in specific timber species or specific markets. So it was a combination of spatial analysis and market analysis. For each of the business models, we were looking at their investment needs. Do these actually require outside investments? And is it of a level that really makes sense, to the RS Group level to be involved in? Were the growth prospects strong enough? Most of the models we looked at had strong growth prospects. So really we were trying to find the absolute, more certain growth prospects, if you like. And I think, as we've talked about already, conservation impact was a key driver, but we also wanted to find examples of recent deals so we can understand how RS would actually get exposure to individual investments and how you would structure that exposure. Next slide, please, Kevin. Yeah, so as I said, the intellectual challenge for us was that we were assessing 50 different business models covering those 5 economic transitions, so that would include things like hotels restoring coastline areas and mangroves, and trying to compare that consistently with companies engaged in certified forest management or the harvesting of non-timber forest products, and even technology companies. So these are vastly different business models. And we came up with a kind of 4-part scoring system. So we tried to do this quantitatively. That may give the impression of an overly sophisticated level of analysis. There were 6 of us, but we were working on this only for a short period. So the level of depth we could go into for each of those 50 models was obviously limited. What we were trying to do really was look at the strength of this environmental and social impact pathway. Partly that was looking at the overall scale of impact in terms of hectares or in terms of square kilometers, for example, for looking at marine business models. But it was also a case of looking at actual high conservation value areas as well. So rather than just pure carbon, you're looking at volumes of crops, for example, we were looking at high conservation values and impacts on biodiversity. We also wanted to understand the prevalence of public domain examples of actual viable businesses. So, this was actually a really useful measure. It meant that we could quickly separate the wheat from the chaff, where there may be a lot of noise and discussion in the market about particular business models. When you actually look at public examples of viable businesses, that quickly narrows the field. The growth potential assessment was based on not just the sort of policy environment and market growth, but also other drivers, for example, availability of human capital and skilled resources to grow a particular sector. And finally, the interviewees that we spoke to had certain interests in promoting specific models and also had reservations about other models. So we factored in that sentiment in terms of this overall matrix. And this gave us a way of, as I say, quantifying the relative merits of these different business models. And we used that to develop what we call a heat map. And just to show you on the next slide, so just taking forestry as an example here, and forestry was actually one of the sectors that I was involved in researching. Some of the other sectors I wasn't involved in, so I'll happily duck any questions on some of those other sectors or pass them to James. But for forestry, as you can see here on the left-hand side, we looked at a high level, we looked at 4 different business models there: the harvesting of non-timber forest products, certified natural forest management, certified plantations, industrial tree growing, if you like, and then forest carbon and PES schemes. And within each of those, we'd often separate that into separate business models. So for example, when it comes to certified plantations, there is a big difference in terms of the operations that a large scale commercial enterprise tree plantation company would be involved in versus that which your family or a small group of people managing 1 or 2 hectares in Vietnam or Laos, for example, as part of an outgrower scheme. So we assessed all of these models separately across those 4 measures I've mentioned previously. You'll see a lot of numbers there in the table. Please ignore the very small numbers. Those are footnotes from our internal report. But essentially, each of these was scored 1 to 3, and then the total score on the right-hand side gave us a way of prioritizing. So overleaf, please. Next slide, please. We then, I guess, took those highest scoring models and developed a shortlist there. And then we focused again, we really delved into, because most of these were scoring very high in terms of growth potential, we really wanted to look at how they were differentiated in terms of impact on nature. And that gave us a way of being even more specific in terms of our interest areas. And I'll give you just a moment just to have a look at some of those different business models that were high scoring, and hopefully you'll appreciate just the breadth and diversity of business models which were under consideration there. Given that breadth and that diversity, and given the information we'd passed on to RS about the relative merits of these business models, I think RS then took a very sensible and pragmatic approach and said, well, let's group the most promising business models into what we call verticals, because those will have natural synergies and connections and can be managed cohesively. So those 2 verticals were terrestrial and marine business models. And the next slide summarizes on both terrestrial and marine business models the 6 prioritized business models, which were then explored in the next phase of the project. So I will just walk you through on 3 slides the terrestrial business models. I'll give you a very brief overview and description of what we mean by those business models, and James will do the same on the marine business models. And then at that point, we'll be handing back over to Ronnie, who will talk about some of the broad challenges facing the development of all of these business models, and we'll give you some specific examples from certain business models. But just to move on to the next slide, going into the terrestrial business models. So you probably won't be surprised to hear that forest carbon and payment for ecosystem service business models were prioritized. And there were a number of reasons for those. I guess the most obvious was for their potential direct impact on high biodiversity ecosystems. What we've really tried to do is through this analysis is to capture those models and those interventions that can have tangible impacts on biodiversity under threat. And so forest carbon and PES schemes are, I think, there's a level of consensus now about the opportunity for those business models to do this. So that was one of the key factors there. And just to say that we actually combined forest carbon and PES schemes under one heading, just recognizing that there is often overlap between, for example, watershed protection schemes and forest conservation projects, and recognizing the sort of operational linkages between those as well. On the next slide, this will hopefully be of some interest to those that are proponents of agroforestry. So we noticed across many of the high impact models, there was an element of agroforestry which was recurring across lots of the different production methods. Agroforestry is something which many organizations have promoted, including FAO, for decades. And I think one of the challenges now, given that there is this recognition of the agroforestry benefits, one of the challenges is to find ways to scale up agroforestry in a way which generates a stable return for investors and a predictable return for investors. There is a hope that by combining carbon credits into some of these projects, that could help diversify revenue streams and strengthen the business case for investing in agroforestry commodities. We at this point, we did not narrow the scope of the Nature Venture Builder to specific tree crops or commodity types. So we've kept that deliberately open for the moment. And then on the next slide, the final area, which I would say is developing more recently and more quickly than the other two models, is soil carbon. For those joining us from the well, actually, we won't have people joining from the US this time zone, but for those with an interest in the US markets, they'll know that in North America, there has been very strong growth in soil carbon projects. The interest, I think, in Asia is the extent to which that success and that traction can be copied and replicated in Asia. We recognize to be able to do that, there will be upskilling and there'll be technology needs. But there's definitely the potential there for Southeast Asia to explore this, and hopefully also for the Nature Venture Builder to play a role in promoting soil carbon projects. This clearly links as a theme to forest carbon PES projects and to agroforestry as well. So strong linkages between all of these three business models in the terrestrial vertical. We will be coming back to some of these models when we talk about enabling conditions and challenges. But for the moment, if we can just move to the next slide. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to James Spurgeon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Well, good morning and good afternoon to everybody here. It really is a great pleasure to be presenting today. So thank you very much to Kevin for organising and hosting. But it's also been fantastic to be involved in this both fascinating and hugely important topic. So a big thanks to Chris for and his team for getting me involved, but also Ronnie and her team at RS Group who were fantastic in supporting, and also Fabian Heuler from Poseidon, who's really helped with it too. Before I get into the three marine business models that I covered, just wanted to reiterate that there really were so many other excellent potential business models out there that we could have included, and the three transition themes that sustain value looked at were the restoration and avoided land use, the sustainable ocean resources management, and the transparent and sustainable supply chain themes, and each of those had around 10 different business models and a number of very good ones that we could have selected. And it just so happened that the three that we landed on were all actually marine, hence the three marine that I'm going to be presenting now. And in fact, that was great from our perspective because it plays to our strengths. I've been involved in coastal marine projects for many years, doing a lot of coral reef mangrove work around impact valuation and assessing investment impacts and opportunities too, including a lot of work in Southeast Asia. Now, on the marine business model side, there were a number of similarities with the terrestrial side, and I guess what really came through for us was the fact that we were really looking for multiple revenue streams to enhance the resilience effectively of these business models in these sort of uncertain and challenging times. And also they have a variety of different ecosystem services, both on the recreation ecotourism side, but also fisheries, coast protection, and so on, which we wanted to factor in and make the most of as much as we could. Then there's also the strong carbon focus, and as you can see from the map, which shows the mangrove distribution in Southeast Asia, there really is extensive coverage. I mean, there's 4.5 million hectares of mangrove across Southeast Asia, and a third of those have been a third of 1 million hectares have been identified as restorable. So considerable potential, and given the fact that mangroves apparently sequester carbon 4 times faster than terrestrial forests, then there is significant opportunities. Plus the fact that another study identified $65 billion worth a year of flood and storm damage benefits from mangroves too. So moving on to the next slide. Just going to run through quickly now the 3 marine business models that were selected. So the first one was integrated marine protected area management with blue carbon focus too. This was really centered around tourism user fees, and we identified a number of business models out there and companies already undertaking this type of work. So Blue Finance in particular, they have a couple of these projects in operation in Philippines at the moment, and what they've been doing is setting up special purpose entities that work with local governments and local partners, and are effectively long-term collaborative agreements, and looking to make the most of the full range of different ecosystem services provided by the marine environment. So as you can see, there's a number of different potential revenue streams that are being looked into and have potential to enhance that resilience, particularly given issues like COVID, where tourism numbers can decline. You therefore need to have additional sources of revenue to keep the operations going, and also with potentially fluctuating carbon prices too. Selected because of the hugely significant positive impact potential, and there were many poorly managed marine protected areas in the region. A lot of just paper parks that are protected in name, but physically they're not really protected. And there's also, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, a growing interest in sustainable financing and blue economy, so around marine protected areas and blue carbon, a huge and growing interest. And as I mentioned already, the resilience from the mixed revenue streams. So move on to the next slide, please. So the second priority business model selected was what we call Mangrove Blue Carbon Plus. So picking up on the fact that there's the extensive areas of mangrove that need both conserving and restoring, and the fact that there is huge growing interest in blue carbon, but also the fact that the blue carbon market is voluntary at the moment. And many of the projects are pretty expensive to get off the ground, and the carbon price isn't always that high, and certainly not high enough to make some of these initiatives viable. But hopefully in the future, as demand grows and prices increase, they will become more viable. But in the meantime, there's huge potential for linking a range of other potential revenue streams with the conservation and restoration of mangroves, and that ranges from tourism to aquaculture and fisheries, whether it's finfish or shellfish, and also as I mentioned, there's massive coast protection insurance too. So this was selected because of the high importance, abundance and restoration potential of mangroves in the region. And also it can be integrated with the previous model as well. So with the Nature Venture Builder, as Ronnie hopefully will explain, the potential for sort of cross-fertilization and working between the different business models that are selected for support, which will be very powerful as well, working with the synergies between them. And the final slide I have on the marine business models. So again, linking in the blue carbon, but this is around seaweed production and processing, but also beyond that, the marketing and sales too. And as many of you will probably have picked up, there is really growing interest in seaweed as an amazing product because of the range of different properties that it has. So this was selected due to the high impact potential, the many different uses of seaweed. I mean, it's product use, whether that's for food or pharmaceuticals or plastic alternatives, whole range of innovative ways that seaweed can be used. And no chemicals are typically needed, and there's a side benefit that the seaweeds can also clean the water as well. They can also act as a habitat for marine organisms too. And similarly, they have a pretty rapid sequestration rate as well, but it's much more early days in terms of seaweed carbon sequestration relative to mangroves and relative to terrestrial. So a lot of work still needs to go on in that space. And finally, again, this model has obviously very good synergies with the other two, and that they can all be undertaken to a degree within the same environment and marine system. So on that note, I will hand back to Ronnie, who will, I think, talk a little bit about some of the challenges and other aspects of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Chris, for a very thorough explanation of our work. It sounds like we kind of covered this in 15-20 minutes, but actually it was a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of effort that's put in by the whole team. So thank you again. So yes, I think as we mentioned, one of the objectives of the study was really to talk and think through what are the challenges and bottlenecks for these business models to scale and to be replicated in Asia. And from RS Group's perspective, is really to understand which ones of these challenges can possibly, be supported by intervention and which ones cannot, and therefore help us position the venture builder more strategically against these challenges. And so you see a slide here which has summarized these challenges into 4 key areas. And as you see, there are some of these challenges which we think can be addressed by intervention. For example, if you look at the carbon knowledge and pricing, where I think obviously, even though the carbon credit market is really hot, but it is not an easy process to have to go through verification process, application, and eventually to be able to sell these carbon credit projects. And so whether it is a small forest carbon project or whether it's a marine protected area type of project, it's not easy for the entrepreneur to access these carbon credit markets. And so this is where I think the venture builder can come in with support and expertise to help these entrepreneurs. But if you look at, say, policy, I see that's always a big enabler, but also a big bottleneck for a lot of these ventures to take place. So that would be something that would be much more difficult, I think, for intervention. And then there are some of the more structural kind of challenges, such as availability of projects, lack of talent, and the high cost that is needed. So I think it was very useful for us to see what these challenges and pain points were, and then to think about, from our group's perspective, is where we are best suited to intervene. But I'll pass to James and Chris to go into some of these in a little bit more detail, especially from the perspective of the 2 verticals, being forest and marine as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie. So just to give a bit more colour to these points on the terrestrial business models, And firstly, just to say also that we are here specifically talking about challenges and pain points in the context of the interventions that the Nature Venture Builder can make. So this is a somewhat negative and kind of subdued view of these business models. I just want to emphasize these business models were prioritized over many other business models because of the opportunity and the potential there. So these are opportunities that we're very excited about and we think have huge potential. Nevertheless, they do face challenges in the short and medium term. Forest carbon, I know there are some people that have mentioned in the chat they have an interest in forestry, and so if they've been following this developments in this area for some time, they will probably remember all the way back to 2007, 2008, where there was still a lot of discussion at that time on the dynamics between countries pursuing national project coordination versus individual projects essentially acting autonomously and selling credits at the project level. And that debate and that dilemma still continues, sort of 14 years later, which is quite frustrating to people and to investors who want to push this market forwards. But we have seen some attempts to find ways around that, and investors in many cases are pushing ahead regardless, despite this uncertainty and despite the need for much more development of RED readiness levels in these target countries in Southeast Asia. I think also to really scale up the forest carbon market, there is a need for development of skills and human capital to be expanded across the region. So it could be that one intervention would be to partner with organizations that can really train people to develop these projects at scale and in a replicable way. I think one of the challenges also on forest carbon or opportunity, depending on how you look at it, has been around ecosystem restoration concessions in Indonesia, for example. We know that despite some of the uncertainties about how those ERCs can be used, we know there continues to be a strong interest in them and a lot of competition for those concessions. So I think forest carbon itself still has some long-running issues which need to be dealt with, but nevertheless we do see investors moving ahead with projects, and our report included examples of quite sizable investments some projects have managed to gain so far. I think in terms of agroforestry, one of the specific challenges there in terms of pricing is around the fluctuations in certain cash crop prices. So, that is a challenge which any sizable project would need to manage. That can partly be done through committed off-taker relationships. But we also know that having those off-takers on board and having reliable outgrower structures as part of that model is complex, and it takes a lot of time to develop. For agroforestry, also for very large plantations, very large projects, environmental impact assessments are still going to be needed. We are talking about areas of high conservation value, or certainly buffer zones around some of these plantations. And I know from personal experience, it's extremely important to make sure any assumptions about degraded forest are verified, and conservation values are thoroughly mapped out before projects get underway, or even at the planning stage. I think the integration of carbon into agroforestry will continue to be a challenge, but also an opportunity. We know with the Lao Pakadang rubber model, that was quite an interesting example of how that can be done and is happening. And I think there's also a role that can be played by extending training and support to communities and companies that want to engage in agroforestry in Southeast Asia. As I said earlier, FAO and others have been pretty focused on this over the years, but it would be nice to see a stronger engagement of the private sector in some of those promotion efforts. An interesting project example we identified was Agronomica in the Philippines, which actually uses a financing mechanism combined with training and extension support to promote agroforestry in the Philippines. And finally, just to say, On the soil carbon side, as I mentioned, there is a lot of good experience and skills in North America. Transferring those over to Asia will be something which will require a concerted effort. I think for Southeast Asia, we still need to find a sort of proof of concept and large scale model there. So that is a work in progress, but one with a huge opportunity attached to it. And I think, it's worth recognizing that the soil carbon market is not necessarily focused exclusively on farms and farmers. Soil carbon increases and can be managed and restored in forestry projects also. So this is something which is developing right now here in the UK, the soil carbon market, and ways of verifying soil carbon levels are just really getting off the ground here in the UK, for example. And it could be that with things like in-field sensors, improved technology, this can be a viable opportunity for Asia. So lots of potential there for interventions and support. And again, just to give you another example of what we saw as an interesting and successful project to date, the Grow Indigo initiative in India, we thought was a really useful model for people to be looking at. So I'll just hand over to James to add in some examples from the marine business models.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, just conscious of the time, just want to make a few quick points, really. One is firstly to say that many of the challenges are similar for the marine side as they were for the terrestrial, but the marine side does have a few particular features about it that makes it slightly more challenging. That's the complex sort of three-dimensional nature of the sea and the seabed, and the multiple uses that go on in the marine environment, and the fact that property rights are much more of an issue in terms of who owns what and who has the right access to resources. And also the science is generally much less well developed on the marine side, as I mentioned, on the mangrove carbon sequestration and seagrasses, for example. But another really important point is that although there are a number of challenges identified, there are many fantastic solutions coming through and incredible support and interest in overcoming these challenges through things like smart financing mechanisms, technology, but also on the policy and regulation side. Obviously, COP26 coming up, mangroves, I'm sure, will feature in that, and governments are increasingly looking at ecosystem valuation, natural capital valuation, and creating the conditions for revenue generation through some of these ecosystem services which don't typically have a market. So very, very optimistic, but there are challenges, and unintended consequences is something as well that won't have time to go into, but needs to be borne in mind. But Ronnie, back to you.
Thank you, James and Chris. Hopefully that gives a picture of what are the coming challenges and bottlenecks that's facing. But I think, as Chris and James emphasized, there are a lot of opportunities that comes with it, and therefore I think that was how and where we then narrowed down to the two verticals on land and marine for the venture builder to focus on. And so I just want to wrap up going back to the nature venture builder that I mentioned at the beginning, which was really the whole objective to pave way for the objective of the feasibility studies, to pave way for the venture builder. And so, as I mentioned here, is what we saw as the key purpose of the venture builder is really to help some of these high potential ventures that we see to survive through that valley of death, which is anywhere from a post-pilot or post-feasibility, proof of concept kind of stage, all the way to when they're institutional capital ready. That missing middle is where we don't see enough intervention in the form of whether it is a venture builder or a more high touch type of accelerator incubators, especially in Asia. And so what the idea of the venture builder that we have in mind is really to help these ventures when they are post-pilot phase and give them all kind of support that is needed in order to fundraise and scale to that point where they are ready. And the way that we intend to do that, as you can see here on the slide, is a few key areas. First one is the basic business building support. And so I think if you look at, if you remember on the challenges slide, one of the key areas was the lack of available and established ventures and projects in the space. And a lot of the time is because some of these projects may have a very good intention for impact, clear impact goals, but often they lack the kind of business acumen that is needed for a successful and viable and sustainable venture. So it's really about providing the basic building aspects to a venture. And this could apply across different industry, even in the VC world. So it could include anywhere from business strategy, helping them strengthen their business model, thinking about governance, thinking about HR, legal, IT. So it's really that broad range of basic building services that we think we can help to infuse into the venture and to make it more resilient. And I think James and Chris also mentioned a lot about multi-revenue a model, which is, for example, it could be an agroforestry model, but we could introduce a carbon overlay to it. Again, introducing additional levels of revenue to build up the resilience of the business model. And so this is around the basic business of that. And then obviously secondary is ESG and impact, where again, although by nature these are purpose-driven kind of ventures, but I think the importance of measurement and impact will be really important, especially when they go to the level of fundraising and scaling. And then corporate and financial development, again, this could be fundraising, marketing, and investor relations, that kind of support. And lastly, really importantly, is around carbon market support. We call it the carbon overlay. So if you remember when we went through the two verticals, whether it's forest carbon, whether it's mangroves, there's always a carbon credit element to that. And the reason is because we believe that in order for one of these nature-based businesses to be resilient, for the business resilient, you really do need to leverage on the carbon credit markets, which is really hot and is growing. But at the same time, we know there's a lot of challenges that faces that as well. But the overlay of this, like adding the carbon credit element, whether it's blue carbon or is red when it's land, we think that's going to be really important, again, to build up the resilience of these business models. And we're hoping that through the venture builder and the partners, we can help these ventures more easily introduce that element into whatever that they might be doing, be it MPA, mangrove protected areas, to agroforestry. So sort of integrate that into the business model to strengthen that. So that's overall the idea behind the venture builder. For RS Group, we are looking to fund the setup and the development cost for the first few years of this venture builder, as well as provide the investment capital which will be needed to invest through the venture into the venture, so that the venture builder will be providing both financial and non-financial support. And maybe Kevin, if you can go to the next slide on that, where we talk about the next step. Thank you. And so overall, we're hoping that we can launch the venture builder by end of this year or early next year. But right now we are in the stage of finalizing the business plan. But very importantly is having to pull together a solid and robust team on the ground team for the venture builder in order for us to be able to realize this vision. So last and very important point here is that if there is any interest from anyone on what we're doing around the venture builder, whether you're coming at this from a potential investment perspective, funding perspective, or pipeline projects that you see that you could potentially recommend to us, or from a talent perspective, and you want to join this team, please let us know. We have our contact details here. We'd love to hear from you. At the end of the day, we need as much help from everyone to hopefully realize this vision of the venture builder and the next step towards building up the nature-based solutions ecosystem here in Asia. So I think that's all from us in terms of the feasibility and what we're doing. And Kevin has very kindly offered to help with moderating the Q&A session.
Thanks, Ronnie. And we've received some questions in the Q&A pod. It looks like Martin and I think Joan from FOCO have asked somewhat overlapping questions around engagement with the policy dimension. How do we plan on accounting for externalities, and what might be some good examples in terms of private-public collaborations in this space that you've seen?
So maybe I'll start and I'll pass that to Chris and James. So I see the question from Martin. Yes, I think definitely policy is absolutely crucial, and that's why it was highlighted as one of the key pain points. And I think that is why for a lot of these projects that we've seen, both through the feasibility as well as through the convergence window, you see the importance of engaging the government at a very early stage. And this is where the multi-stakeholder issue comes in, which again, another issue is having to spend a lot of time invested in talking to the government, getting the government on board, ensuring that there is enabling conditions. And we're talking about for a specific project in a specific area or province within a certain country. So this is hugely time consuming and is an ongoing effort as well, but it's also really important in order for these kind of projects to happen. And I think there are many examples of this, but definitely agree it is important, but also where it's very timely. So maybe Chris and James can talk more about this as well.
Chris, do you want to?
Well, I'm happy to give you a bit more airtime. I feel as if I've had more than my fair share.
No problem. Great questions. And Martin, yes, I've known Martin for a number of years. And spot on, externalities really is why we live in an unsustainable world, which is why I've been working on how to value them and factor them into the marketplace for the last 30 years. Just done a project for another client looking at what's the appropriate value or price of a ton of carbon, and we landed on something around $100 a ton. But obviously there's lots of issues around that. As soon as you start talking about $100 a ton of carbon, all these projects are massively viable, and there's clearly talk about increasing the price of carbon and increasing taxes, carbon border adjustment prices. So things are moving in the right direction, but probably a little bit too slowly. And then all these other externalities, coast protection function of mangroves, I mean, massive benefits in some places, but they don't have a proper market value. Fortunately, some of the governments in Southeast Asia are taking a lot of interest in natural capital and valuing these externalities and coming up with and putting in place policies that allow mechanisms to capture these revenues. So it is a big issue, and it is improving slowly but surely. There was one other question, which was which challenge to focus on in terms of natural capital. My question there back would be, well, it really depends on what your interests are and what you're trying to achieve. There's so many different challenges, but one fantastic one would be recognition of the different externality values, putting a value on them and factoring that into the marketplace, changing the incentive structures. The incentive structures everywhere globally are in favor of unsustainable projects and business and living. I hope that answers those to a degree.
Chris, your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing I know from personal experience and speaking to some of the people who are searching for projects in these countries, it still tends to be just a handful of committed groups that are trying to develop these projects, particularly on the forest carbon side. And if you're looking at a handful of entities across, maybe half a dozen countries, and you can see that, particularly given the size of some of these countries, you can see that there isn't really enough resource to drive pipeline development. So I do feel that, another key thing that investors can do and governments can do working together is develop a cadre of people with the skills to develop these projects in countries where these projects have the most opportunity. So I think any projects that have a potential sort of knowledge transfer element, a potential training element, I think those would help just generally to build the pipeline. And I just saw, apologies, Kevin, this is probably your job, but I just saw the last couple of questions did have a marine focus to them in terms of seaweed and mangrove restoration. So James, it might be an opportunity for you if we've got the time, but over to you, Kevin.
Mm-hmm. James, we have a couple of questions around thoughts on investment opportunities around mangrove forests and restoration. How could individuals get involved in some of those investment opportunities? And how long is typically a period for the investment cycle?
Yeah, I can try and have a go. So on the individual investments, that's a challenging area. Because I don't think there are that many opportunities, but I'm sure increasingly there'll be new startup companies and apps which will enable investors through, for example, crowdfunding type activities to get involved. So you need to look at crowdsource funding opportunities and identify any there that link to mangroves, blue carbon, marine side, and the payback sort of investment period. I mean, it's really challenging, and it's early days. And Blue Finance have been at this for a few years now. Their startup costs are very significant in terms of getting the infrastructure in place, and their revenues have been very much dependent on visitor numbers, visitor fees. Obviously, in the past year and a half, that's really taken a hit. So the payback period on some of their projects is going to be extended. Again, carbon price, the price that they'll be getting for credits will be variable. So we're talking quite a number of years, but there's all sorts of opportunities for blended finance, so getting money from government and also larger investors and smaller investors to put the money in the pot. But as for specifics and details, highly variable. But you're not going to be getting your money back in the short term, I don't think.
Okay, thanks for that, James. I realize we've passed the hour, and many of you might have subsequent calls or plans after this. So thanks again for joining us today. And as Ronnie has shared, this is an open call for engagement into the venture builder, and we've put details in terms of how to follow up. We invite everyone who's interested to find out more to please contact Ronnie and the team. At AVPN, we believe firmly in the value of collaboration and working together to solve complex issues, and this definitely is one of them. We're excited to be involved in this conversation, and if there's any way we can facilitate subsequent connections, do let us know. Do reach out to Ronnie and the team for additional details. We haven't covered all the questions in the Q&A pod, so what we'll do is we'll circulate these with the speakers for more detailed responses, and we'll send it as a follow-up email to all participants and registrants to the webinar. So thanks again for joining us today, and we hope that you can stay connected on this conversation, on climate action conversations, and look forward to engaging with you in a future session. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.